Danny Carter wiped the grease from his hands and stared at the message on his screen. He read it 3 times because it made no sense. The Galactic Trade Commission was telling him that he now owned the biggest ship in the entire galaxy. Not owned exactly, but he was responsible for fixing it and keeping it running. This had to be a joke. Danny fixed small ships at his tiny repair station near an old asteroid. He worked alone most days with just his computer helper named Chip to talk to. Nobody important even knew his name. The message explained everything in careful words. The Leviathan was the largest ship ever built. It was so big that it had its own gravity system, just to keep from pulling nearby planets out of their orbits. An ancient alien race called the Vorath had built it 10,000 years ago. Since then, different alien species took turns looking after it. Now it was humanity's turn, and somehow they picked Danny from thousands of other engineers. They said his repair logs showed he was good at solving weird problems in creative ways. Danny had 2 weeks to get to Coordination Station 12. That was where they would give him all the codes and information he needed. The message ended with a warning that made his stomach feel tight. It said the Leviathan had certain characteristics that might be hard for human minds to handle. There were files attached with more information. For 3 days, Danny did nothing but read those files. The technical information alone took him 40 hours to get through. The Leviathan was 300 kilometers long. It had over 16 million rooms inside it. The technology that made it work was so advanced that even the smartest aliens in the galaxy only partly understood it. But the psychological reports were what really scared Danny. Every alien species that had taken care of the Leviathan said the same things. The ship was too big, not just in size, but in a way that messed with how you saw things. Engineers talked about feeling lost even when they had perfect maps. They described hallways that seemed to go on forever. They spoke about spaces that felt wrong in ways they could not explain. The Vorath had built something that pushed against the limits of what living minds could comfortably understand. Danny was just a simple mechanic from Earth, who still got nervous in crowded shopping centers. Now he was supposed to be responsible for maintaining this impossible ship. His hands shook as he booked his ticket to Coordination Station 12. The trip took 5 days. Danny spent most of it reading more about the Leviathan and trying not to panic. Other passengers on the transport ship noticed him staring at his datapad with wide eyes. One friendly alien asked if he was okay. Danny just nodded and kept reading. When his shuttle finally approached Coordination Station 12, Danny pressed his face against the window to see the Leviathan. It filled his entire view. The ship was so massive that it looked like a dark metal mountain floating in space. It seemed to absorb light instead of reflecting it. Pictures and videos had not prepared him for the real thing. The Leviathan made the station look like a toy. It made Danny feel smaller than he had ever felt in his life. The shuttle pilot noticed him staring. She was an alien called a Cetarian, and her translation device made her clicking sounds into smooth English words. She asked if this was his first time seeing the ship up close. Danny said yes. The pilot told him that pictures could never capture what the Leviathan really was. She explained that the ship existed partly outside normal space. That was why it looked different depending on how you observed it. This information did not make Danny feel any better at all. At the station, a woman in a military uniform met him. Her name was Commander Lisa Martinez, and she was the human officer who had been working with the previous caretakers of the ship. She seemed professional and calm, but Danny could see tension in her shoulders. She told him that the Kaldrith were ready to hand over control of the ship. The Kaldrith were the aliens who had been taking care of the Leviathan for the past century. Lisa said they had been eager to leave for the past month. Danny asked if something bad had happened. Lisa hesitated before answering. She said nothing specific had gone wrong, but their chief engineer had been acting strange. Danny would see what she meant. The Kaldrith were insect-like aliens known for staying calm and being excellent engineers. Their chief engineer was named Vrex. He stood nearly 8 feet tall with a hard shell-like body covered in ceremonial markings. When Danny entered the briefing room and saw Vrex, he immediately understood what Lisa meant. Vrex looked exhausted in a way that went beyond just being physically tired. His eyes were dull and his antennae drooped. Vrex greeted Danny and said he was relieved that someone had finally arrived. He said the Leviathan needed attention that he could no longer provide. Danny asked if there was a specific problem with the ship. Vrex said yes, all of them. Every system and every hallway and every room. But then he explained that the Leviathan was not actually broken. It worked fine. The problem was that maintaining it required going inside it, being inside it, and that was something Vrex could no longer force himself to do. Vrex showed Danny a holographic display of the ship's status. Everything showed green or yellow lights, nothing red or critical. But Vrex's hands trembled as he touched the controls. He told Danny that the size of the ship was one thing, but the deeper you went inside, the more you felt something. The Leviathan was not empty. Something lived in its depths. Something the Vorath had left behind. Maybe not hostile, but definitely there and definitely aware. Danny felt cold fear run through his body. He asked what kind of something. Vrex said he did not know. Nobody knew. But Danny would feel it when he entered the ship. Everyone did. Some species handled it better than others. Maybe humans would do well. Humans were young and adaptable, and their minds worked differently than other species. The official handover ceremony took 6 hours. Danny received special codes, technical databases that would take years to fully read, and a small implant in his head that would let him connect directly to the Leviathan's ancient computer systems. When Vrex was ready to leave, he put one of his 4 hands on Danny's shoulder. He warned Danny to be careful in the deep sections of the ship. He said the Leviathan showed different things to different minds. Whatever Danny saw down there, he should remember that he chose this job. He should remember that he could leave any time. The ship made people forget that sometimes. Then Vrex was gone, getting on his transport ship with obvious relief. Danny stood alone on the observation deck, staring at the massive vessel that was now his responsibility. He had 48 hours before his first required inspection of the core engineering sections. 48 hours to prepare himself for whatever was waiting inside. Danny spent those hours reading every report he could find, trying to ignore the growing feeling of dread in his chest. Part 2, the docking tunnel connected to the Leviathan with a deep sound that Danny felt in his bones. He stood in the airlock wearing a standard engineering suit and carrying a toolkit that suddenly seemed far too small for what he was about to do. His computer chip spoke through his helmet radio. Chip said the air pressure was good, oxygen levels were normal, and temperature was set for human comfort. Danny was cleared to enter the ship. Danny took a deep breath and opened the inner door. The entrance chamber of the Leviathan was vast. It was not just large, but vast in a way that seemed impossible for the space it occupied. The ceiling disappeared into darkness above, even though his suit sensors said it was only 30 meters high. The walls curved away at angles that looked geometrically wrong. The space felt both enclosed and infinite at the same time. His footsteps echoed strangely with sounds bouncing back from directions that did not match what he could see. Danny activated his recording systems and spoke into his helmet microphone. He said he was beginning documentation of his first entry into the Leviathan main structure. The time was 1400 hours station time. He looked at the map on his wrist display. The route to the first checkpoint looked straightforward. Just 3 main corridors in a straight line. But as Danny started walking, he felt the first touch of what Vrex had warned him about. The corridor ahead seemed to get longer with each step he took. His sensors showed the remaining distance as exactly what it should be. But his eyes and his brain told him something different. The space felt deeper than it was, as if he was looking at it through a lens that changed scale without changing shape. Danny muttered to himself that this was going to take some getting used to. The Leviathan's interior was beautiful in an alien way. The walls were made from materials that shifted color slightly as he moved. They showed patterns that might be decorations or might be functional displays. Every surface was smooth and seamless, as if the entire ship had been grown instead of built. 20 minutes into his walk, Danny reached the first intersection. The corridor split into 6 different directions. Each path looked identical to the others. His map said he needed to take the third one, but when he looked at them, he could not tell which was which. They all felt like the third option. Danny closed his eyes and relied only on the navigation display in his helmet. He chose the path the computer said was correct. When he opened his eyes again, that corridor felt right, and the others somehow became obviously wrong. Danny told himself not to trust his eyes, but to trust the instruments. But that became harder as he went deeper into the ship. The corridors began playing tricks on him. Not through any malfunction, but through their sheer size and strangeness. He would walk for what felt like 10 minutes and discover only 2 minutes had passed. Or the opposite would happen, where a corridor he was sure he had been walking through for 30 seconds had actually taken 15 minutes. Time felt slippery inside the Leviathan. The first checkpoint was an engineering control room filled with maintenance interfaces. Everything was labeled in Vorath writing with translations in 47 different alien languages, floating as holographic text. Danny began running his diagnostics. He checked power flow, structural integrity, and system responsiveness. Everything checked out perfectly. The Leviathan was in better condition than most ships only a decade old, let alone 10,000 years old. But as Danny worked, he began to feel it. The presence that Vrex had mentioned. It was not a physical thing, not a sound or a sight, just an awareness, a sense that the vast empty spaces around him were not quite empty. The Leviathan knew he was here. Danny tried to shake off the feeling and focus on his work, but the sensation persisted and grew stronger the longer he stayed. The ship was not hostile. It was just big, so impossibly big, that its existence created ripples in perception itself. He finished his diagnostics and started the journey back to the airlock. The corridors seemed more cooperative now, as if the ship had accepted his presence. The walk back took exactly as long as it should have. When Danny finally stepped through the airlock back into the station, he felt like he had been holding his breath underwater and just broke the surface. His whole body relaxed at once. Lisa Martinez was waiting for him in the docking bay. She asked how it went. Danny removed his helmet and noticed his hands were still shaking slightly. He told her the ship was operational and everything worked fine. But Vrex had been right. That ship was something else entirely. Lisa asked if he could handle it. Danny thought about the question carefully. The fear had not left him at all, but underneath the fear he felt something else. Curiosity. The Leviathan was unlike anything he had ever encountered in his life. Some part of him wanted to understand it. Danny said he thought he could handle it, but it would take time to get used to the ship. Lisa told him he had 6 months before the first major systems review. She said to use that time to familiarize himself with the Leviathan. Take it slow. Nobody expected him to understand the ship overnight. Danny nodded, but as he walked back to his temporary living quarters, he knew that understanding was not really the issue. The Leviathan did not need to be understood. It needed to be experienced, faced, and accepted. He had just taken his first step into something far larger than himself. Over the next few weeks, Danny established a routine. Every day he would put on his suit, enter the Leviathan, and perform maintenance checks. He gradually expanded his knowledge of the ship's systems. The perceptual strangeness never fully went away, but he learned to work with it instead of fighting against it. Danny discovered something interesting about the Leviathan. The ship seemed to respond to intention. If he approached a task with confidence and a clear purpose, the corridors seemed more navigable. If he was uncertain or anxious, the spaces would stretch and confuse him. It was as if the ship was alive in some way that had nothing to do with biological life. It was aware without being conscious. It was responsive without being intelligent. A vast mechanical presence that filled the space it occupied so completely that it left an impression on reality itself. Danny started keeping detailed notes about his experiences. He wrote down everything he observed about how the ship behaved. He documented which approaches worked and which did not. He was building a guide for future human engineers who would work on the Leviathan after him. The key insight he kept coming back to was acceptance. The Leviathan would never make complete sense to normal human thinking. But humans were adaptable. They could hold multiple perspectives at once. They could accept paradoxes without needing to solve them. Lisa checked in with him weekly. During one meeting, she commented that he seemed to be getting comfortable inside the ship. Danny corrected her. He said he was not comfortable exactly, but he was becoming familiar with it. The Leviathan did not get easier. You just got better at being uncomfortable. Lisa smiled at that and said it was probably the most honest assessment of the ship she had ever heard. 3 months into his job, Danny had explored perhaps 5% of the Leviathan's accessible areas. The ship was simply too large for one person to fully know in a lifetime. But he had learned the main routes and the critical systems. He could navigate to the important engineering nodes without getting lost. He could read the ship's status displays and understand what they were telling him. Most importantly, he had learned to trust his instincts when working inside the Leviathan. His instruments were useful, but his intuition was often more accurate. But Danny had not yet visited the deep sections. Those areas were marked in red on all his maps, not because they were dangerous in a physical sense, but because they were psychologically challenging, even by the Leviathan's already strange standards. Previous caretakers had reported extreme spatial disorientation in those areas. They described time dilation effects and profound psychological discomfort. Some had refused to enter the deep sections at all during their entire century of service. Danny knew that eventually he would need to go there. The deep sections contained some of the most critical systems on the ship. Sooner or later, something would need repair or inspection down in those depths. He told himself he would be ready when that time came. But privately, he was not so sure. 3 months and 2 weeks after Danny took over the Leviathan, he got an alert that changed everything. A minor anomaly had been detected in one of the primary power distribution nodes. The problem was not critical, but it needed investigation soon. Danny pulled up the location on his screen and his stomach dropped. The affected node was in the deep sections. He had known this moment would come eventually, but he had hoped for more time to prepare. Danny spent 2 days reviewing everything he could find about the deep sections. The reports from previous engineers were disturbing. A Caldreth engineer had described corridors that seemed to twist in dimensions that should not exist. A Palaxian engineer had reported losing 3 hours of time while walking through a space her instruments said took only 10 minutes to cross. A human engineer from 70 years ago had written that the deep sections made her question whether she was still sane. But all of them agreed that the systems down there worked perfectly. The Leviathan maintained itself even in those impossible depths. On the morning of the 3rd day, Danny put on his suit and entered the Leviathan through his usual airlock. But this time he followed a different route on his map. The path took him down, though down was a relative concept inside this ship. The Leviathan made its own gravity independent of anything external. The direction of that pull shifted depending on where you were. Danny had learned to just accept that and move forward. The corridors in the deep sections were different from the upper levels. They were darker for one thing. A dim glow came from the walls themselves instead of from light fixtures. The spaces here felt older and more primal. Danny had the sense he was descending into the foundational structures upon which the entire massive vessel had been built. His footsteps made no sound here. The acoustic dampening was so complete that he could hear his own heartbeat and breathing. After walking for an hour, Danny reached a chamber that made him stop completely. It was a sphere maybe 100 meters across. Walkways extended from 6 entry points to a central platform in the middle. But the sphere's interior surface was covered in something that moved. Not mechanically, but organically, like patterns of light flowing across water. Danny stood at the entrance, unable to move. The patterns were mesmerizing. They created shapes that almost looked like writing, like language, like meaning trying to form but never quite succeeding. Danny whispered a question asking what this was. The patterns shifted in response to his voice. They came together briefly into something that looked like a face, then dissolved back into flowing chaos. A wave of dizziness hit Danny hard. This chamber was not part of any schematic he had reviewed. It was not on any map he had studied. He checked his location display. According to his instruments, he was standing in a standard engineering corridor. But that was not what his eyes were showing him at all. Danny called out to Chip through his helmet radio. He asked if Chip was reading this. Chip responded that Danny's vital signs were elevated and recommended he return to the station. Danny asked if Chip could see the chamber, the sphere with the moving patterns. Chip said he was receiving Danny's video feed and it showed Danny standing in an empty corridor. There was no chamber visible to the sensors. Danny closed his eyes and counted to 10 slowly. When he opened them, the sphere was still there. The patterns were still flowing across its surface. This was what Vrex had been trying to warn him about. The Leviathan showed different faces to different minds. Danny was seeing something that his instruments could not detect. Something that existed in a way that bypassed normal sensors and measurements. Very carefully, Danny stepped onto the walkway leading to the central platform. The surface felt solid beneath his feet despite what his instruments were telling him. He moved slowly, testing each step, trusting his senses even when they disagreed with his technology. At the center of the platform stood a pedestal. On that pedestal was an interface unlike anything Danny had seen anywhere else in the Leviathan. It was clearly Vorath technology, but ancient even by their standards. Organic and mechanical elements were woven together in patterns that hurt to look at directly. Danny reached out slowly and placed his hand on the interface. The reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Information flooded into his mind. It did not come through his neural implant, but directly, as if the Leviathan itself was speaking inside his head. He saw flashes of history. He saw the Vorath in their prime, millions of them working together. He saw the construction of the ship over decades. He saw its purpose. The Leviathan was not just a vessel for traveling through space. It was a bridge, a connection between normal space and something else, something the Vorath had discovered and tried to harness. They had not fully succeeded in controlling it, but they had created this ship as a permanent anchor point, a place where reality was thin enough that other things could bleed through from somewhere else. The presence Danny had been feeling all this time was not the ship itself. It was what lay beyond the ship, pressing against the barriers the Vorath had built into the Leviathan's structure. Something curious about the life that moved through this artificial structure. It was not dangerous, but it was vast beyond any possible comprehension. Touching it even indirectly through the Leviathan systems was like trying to drink from an ocean using a straw. Danny pulled his hand back suddenly, gasping for air. The chamber remained for a moment longer, then faded away like smoke. He found himself standing in an ordinary corridor with his hand resting on a standard maintenance panel. The power fluctuation he had come here to investigate was gone, fixed somehow by his interaction with that impossible interface. Danny stood there for a long time trying to process what had just happened. His heart was racing and his hands were shaking, but mixed with the fear was a feeling of awe. The Leviathan had shown him something true, something that existed beneath the physical structure of metal and technology. Now he understood why previous caretakers had struggled so much. The ship was not just big. It was a doorway. Walking through it meant brushing against something infinite. Eventually, Danny made himself start walking back toward the airlock. The return journey took longer than expected. The corridor seemed reluctant to let him go, as if the ship wanted him to stay and see more. But Danny had reached his limit for one day. He needed time to think about what he had experienced. He needed to be in normal space for a while, surrounded by things that made sense. When he finally emerged from the airlock 6 hours after entering, Lisa was waiting for him with a worried expression. She said he had been inside longer than planned and had not responded to several check-in calls. Danny realized his radio had stopped working at some point, probably when he entered that sphere chamber. He told Lisa he was fine, just tired. She looked at him closely and seemed to understand he was not telling her everything, but she did not press him for details. Danny went to his quarters and sat alone in the dark for 2 hours. He kept replaying the experience in his mind. The patterns on the sphere walls, the rush of information when he touched the interface, the sense of something vast and aware on the other side of reality. Most people would have run away after an experience like that. They would have quit and gone home. But Danny felt something different. He felt called to go back. Over the next week, Danny returned to the deep sections 3 more times. Each visit revealed new chambers and new interfaces. The Leviathan was showing him things that no previous caretaker had seen, or at least none that had written about it. Danny began to understand that the ship was not just responding to him. It was teaching him, showing him how it really worked, not the mechanical systems that anyone could maintain, but the deeper systems that connected to whatever lay beyond. Danny started documenting his experiences in a private journal. He did not share these notes with anyone, not even Lisa. Some things were too strange to explain in official reports, but he wanted a record for himself, a way to track what he was learning and where the ship was taking him, because it was definitely taking him somewhere. The Leviathan had a purpose for showing him these things. Danny just had to figure out what that purpose was. He also noticed changes in himself. Working in the deep sections was becoming easier. The disorientation and fear were fading. He could walk through the impossible spaces without his instruments and not get lost. He could look at the moving patterns without feeling dizzy. His mind was adapting to the strangeness in ways he had not thought possible. Maybe this was why they had chosen a human for this job. Humans were young and flexible. Their minds had not settled into rigid patterns yet. They could still change and grow in response to new experiences. 6 months into his tenure as chief engineer, Danny had developed what he thought of as a relationship with the Leviathan. It was not friendship exactly because the ship was not alive in any conventional sense, but there was communication happening between them. The ship showed him things and he learned to interpret what those things meant. He fixed problems not by following technical manuals, but by feeling where the ship needed attention. Other engineers throughout history had maintained the Leviathan from the outside, treating it like any other machine. Danny was learning to work with it from the inside, as a partner rather than just a caretaker. Lisa had noticed the change in him. During their weekly meetings, she would study his face and ask careful questions. She wanted to know what was happening in the deep sections, but Danny found it hard to explain. How could he describe chambers that existed outside normal space? How could he talk about interfaces that communicated through direct mental contact? How could he make anyone understand that the ship was not just a structure, but a threshold between realities? So mostly he gave her technical reports about system status and maintenance schedules. The deeper truth he kept to himself. The other thing Danny had learned was that he was not the first to figure this out. As he explored more of the deep sections, he found evidence of previous engineers who had gone beyond the standard maintenance routines. There were marks on certain interfaces that suggested repeated contact. There were personal items left in hidden alcoves, offerings maybe, or just markers that someone had been there and understood. The Voreth had built layers of meaning into this ship. The surface layer that everyone saw was just a vessel, a meeting place, a neutral ground for galactic politics. But beneath that was something else entirely. Danny was pondering these mysteries when the crisis hit. It started with a routine system alert, a minor fluctuation in one of the antimatter containment fields. Danny pulled up the diagnostics and his blood went cold. What had started as a minor fluctuation was cascading. One containment field was destabilizing, and that was affecting the fields around it. The automated systems were trying to compensate, but they were failing one by one. Danny had less than an hour before the containment breach would force an evacuation of an entire section of the ship. That had not happened in over 1,000 years. If it happened on his watch, it would be a disaster. Danny grabbed his suit and ran for the nearest airlock. He did not have time to follow the standard routes. The affected section was deep in the ship's interior, and the normal paths would take too long. But Danny had been learning how the Leviathan really worked. He had been learning to navigate by intention, rather than by maps. He entered the ship, and instead of heading for the marked corridors, he simply moved toward where he needed to be. The ship responded to his urgency. Corridors that should have taken 20 minutes to traverse compressed to 5. Spaces that normally felt endless became short and direct. The Leviathan was helping him. Danny reached the containment chamber with 15 minutes to spare. The room was filled with warning lights and alarm sounds. The main control interface showed 17 different parameters, all drifting into dangerous ranges. Standard procedure would be to adjust them one at a time, but that would take at least 30 minutes. Danny did not have 30 minutes. He had maybe 10 before the cascade became irreversible. He placed both hands on the primary control surface and did something that no manual or training guide would ever recommend. He opened his mind to the ship completely. He stopped thinking about the technical details and simply focused on what he needed. The containment had to hold. The systems had to stabilize. The crisis had to end. Danny pushed that intention through his hands into the interface, letting the Leviathan understand what he was asking for. The ship responded in a way it never had before. The interface came alive under his hands with lights and sensations that were not part of its normal operation. Danny felt the ship's vast intelligence focusing on this single problem. He felt systems engaging that he had not even known existed. The ancient safety mechanisms built by the Vorath thousands of years ago activated in ways they had not needed to in centuries. The cascade failure reversed itself. Containment fields stabilized one after another. Within 5 minutes, the crisis was completely resolved. Every parameter was back in safe ranges. Danny stood in the chamber, breathing hard. He could feel the ship's presence around him more clearly than ever before. It felt like approval, like satisfaction, like a job well done. He spoke out loud to the empty air, thanking the ship. The lights in the chamber flickered once in response. Danny had to sit down for a few minutes because his legs were shaking. What he had just done should not have been possible. No single engineer could manually stabilize that many systems that quickly, but he had not done it alone. The Leviathan had done most of the work. Danny had just asked and shown the ship what needed to happen. When Danny returned to the station, he found Lisa waiting with a concerned expression. Behind her was a live video transmission from the Galactic Trade Commission. They had been monitoring the situation remotely, ready to intervene if the crisis had escalated. The transmission showed a Palaxian named Cora, who served as the commission chair. She had gray skin and large eyes that looked at Danny with what seemed like curiosity, mixed with confusion. Cora spoke in her own language, but the translation came through clearly. She said that Danny's handling of the situation had been remarkable. They had reviewed all the telemetry data. The Leviathan systems had responded to his inputs in ways they had never seen before in thousands of years of observation. She wanted to know how he had accomplished this. Danny thought carefully about how to answer. He said that the ship was more than just a machine. It had been alone for a long time, maintained by species who were afraid of it, who kept it at arm's length. He thought maybe it was lonely, or maybe it just needed someone willing to work with it instead of just working on it. Cora was silent for a moment. Then she said that was a highly unorthodox assessment. Danny agreed and said it was a highly unorthodox ship. Another pause, then Cora's features softened into what might have been a smile for her species. She said the Commission was very pleased with his performance. They were extending humanity's stewardship of the Leviathan indefinitely. Danny could serve as chief engineer for as long as he was willing to continue. After the transmission ended, Lisa found Danny standing in the observation deck staring at the massive ship. She asked if he was planning to stay. Danny said yes without hesitation. He explained that he was starting to understand why the Vorath had built the Leviathan. It was not just a ship or a station or a meeting place. It was a reminder. Lisa asked what it reminded people of. Danny said it reminded them that they were small, that there were things bigger and stranger than any individual being, and that was actually okay. The Leviathan terrified most people because it forced them to confront their own insignificance, but there was freedom in that too. Once you accepted how small you were, you stopped trying to control everything. You just learned to exist alongside the vast things and found your place in the spaces between them. Danny turned to Lisa and smiled. He said he had gotten kind of attached to this impossible ship. It needed someone who was not afraid to go into its depths, and he was not afraid anymore. Not in the way he had been at the beginning. Now the fear had transformed into something else. Respect maybe, or awe, or just acceptance of mystery. Lisa nodded like she understood, even though Danny suspected she did not really. You had to experience the Leviathan directly to truly get it. Words were not enough. Over the following weeks, Danny continued his explorations of the deep sections. He was finding new chambers almost every day now. The ship was opening itself to him in ways it had not for any previous caretaker. He found rooms filled with technology that seemed to operate on principles that had nothing to do with physics, as humans understood it. He found corridors that led to places his instruments said were impossible. He found interfaces that connected to systems he suspected might not be entirely real in a conventional sense. But Danny also found something else. He found peace. Working in the Leviathan's depth should have been terrifying. It should have driven him to madness like it had affected so many others. Instead, Danny felt more centered and calm than he ever had in his life. The vastness did not diminish him. It gave him perspective. His problems and worries seemed smaller when he was walking through spaces that touched infinity. The concerns of daily life faded when he was communing with something 10,000 years old. Danny realized that this was the gift the Vorath had really built into their ship. Not just a vessel or a tool, but a place of transformation. Anyone who truly opened themselves to the Leviathan came out changed. Not damaged, but expanded. Able to hold bigger thoughts and feel deeper connections. The ship was not just a reminder of how small individuals were. It was a teacher showing them how to be comfortable with that smallness, while still being part of something magnificent. 2 years after Danny took responsibility for the Leviathan, everything had changed and nothing had changed. The ship was exactly as vast and impossible as it had always been, but Danny had changed in ways he could not have imagined when he first arrived. He moved through the Leviathan's corridors now with the confidence of someone who belonged there. The perceptual tricks that had once terrified him were now familiar friends. He had learned to read the ship's moods, to sense when it wanted to, show him something new, to understand when it needed him to fix something versus when it was testing him. Word of Danny's success had spread throughout the galaxy. Engineers from dozens of species requested permission to visit and learn from him. The Galactic Trade Commission had started sending observers to document his methods. Everyone wanted to know how this human had managed to do what centuries of their best engineers had failed to accomplish. How had he not just maintained the Leviathan, but actually connected with it? Danny tried to explain in reports and presentations. He wrote detailed guides about working with intention rather than just following procedures. He described the importance of accepting mystery instead of demanding complete understanding. But he knew his words only captured a fraction of the truth. The real truth was that Danny had stopped being afraid, not just of the Leviathan, but of the bigger questions it represented. What lay beyond the edges of known space? What consciousness really was? Whether reality was just one layer among many. These questions used to make him anxious. Now they filled him with wonder. The Leviathan had taught him that not knowing everything was fine. In fact, it was beautiful. Mystery was not an obstacle to overcome, but a gift to appreciate. On this particular day, Danny was making one of his regular deep section patrols. He had discovered that the ship stayed healthier when he visited these areas frequently, not because they needed physical maintenance, but because they needed presence, attention, acknowledgement. The Leviathan was not alive, but it was not entirely dead either. It existed in some category between those extremes, and that in-between state required a different kind of care. Danny reached a chamber he had visited many times before. The sphere with the moving patterns. This had been the first place where the ship had really shown itself to him. He stood on the central platform and placed his hand on the ancient interface. Information flowed into his mind, but gently now, not overwhelming, like that first time. The ship was showing him something new today, a memory from the Vorath who had built this place. Danny saw through ancient eyes. He witnessed the moment when the Vorath had first discovered the phenomenon that would lead them to build the Leviathan. They had been exploring the boundaries between normal space and other dimensions. They had found a place where the walls between realities were thin. Instead of being afraid, they had been curious. They had asked what would happen if they built something permanent at that threshold. A structure that could exist in both realities at once. The Leviathan was their answer. A ship that was also a bridge. A machine that was also a gateway. A tool that was also a temple. The Vorath had poured their collective wisdom into creating something that would outlast their civilization. They knew their species would eventually fade as all species did, but they wanted to leave behind something that would continue to teach and transform whoever came after them. The Leviathan was their gift to the future, a gift that Danny was now honored to be the guardian of. The vision faded and Danny opened his eyes. He felt tears on his cheeks, though he did not remember starting to cry. The generosity of the Vorath moved him deeply. They had built this impossible thing not for power or glory, but for the benefit of beings who would not exist for thousands of years. That was true vision. That was true hope. Danny sent a thought of gratitude toward whatever remained of the Vorath consciousness in the ship. The lights flickered in response. When Danny returned to the station that day, he found an unexpected visitor waiting. It was Vrex, the Kaldrith engineer who had handed the ship over to Danny 2 years ago. Vrex looked different now. The exhaustion and dullness were gone. His compound eyes were bright and his antennae stood tall. He greeted Danny warmly and said he had to come see how Danny was doing. Word had reached the Kaldrith homeworld about the human engineer who had succeeded where so many others had struggled. They sat together in the observation lounge looking at the Leviathan through the large windows. Vrex asked Danny how he had done it. How had he overcome the fear and the disorientation? Danny thought about the question. He said he had stopped trying to overcome anything. Instead, he had learned to accept. The Leviathan did not need to be conquered or mastered. It needed to be respected and listened to. Once he understood that, everything else fell into place. Vrex made a clicking sound that the translator rendered as laughter. He said that was such a human answer. Humans were good at accepting paradoxes. The Kaldrith mind always wanted clear categories and definite answers. That approach worked well for most engineering problems, but not for the Leviathan. Maybe that was why the ship had been waiting for humanity's turn to find someone who could truly work with it. Danny smiled and said maybe the ship had been patient, waiting for the right mind to come along. They talked for hours. Vrex shared stories from his time on the Leviathan. The strange experiences he had, the moments of fear, the sense of something vast pressing against his consciousness. Now that he had distance from it, Vrex could appreciate the experience more. He said it had changed him even though it had been difficult. He was a better engineer now because the Leviathan had forced him to think differently. Danny understood completely. The ship changed everyone who really engaged with it. That was its nature and its purpose. Before Vrex left, he told Danny something important. He said the Galactic Trade Commission was discussing making Danny's position permanent beyond even the extended human tenure. They were considering creating a new role specifically for him. Guardian of the Leviathan, they were calling it. Someone who would stay with the ship regardless of which species officially held stewardship. Someone who could provide continuity and deeper understanding as different civilizations came and went. Freck said Danny should think about what that would mean. It would be a life commitment. Once he accepted, there would be no going back to normal existence. Danny did think about it. He spent several days walking through the Leviathan's corridors, considering what Vrex had told him. Being the Guardian would mean giving up any other life. It would mean dedicating himself completely to this ship and what it represented. No family of his own, no home planet to return to. Just him and the Leviathan, together indefinitely. For most people, that would sound like a prison sentence. But for Danny, it sounded like purpose. He realized he had already made his choice years ago when he first touched that ancient interface. The Leviathan had chosen him, and he had chosen it back. Everything since then had just been the working out of that mutual decision. Danny contacted the Galactic Trade Commission and told them he accepted the role of Guardian. They scheduled a formal ceremony for 1 month later where representatives from all member species would attend to witness his oath. The ceremony was held in one of the Leviathan's grand meeting halls. Thousands of beings from across the galaxy gathered to watch. Danny stood before them wearing a special suit designed for the occasion. It combined human engineering aesthetics with Vorath symbolic patterns. Lisa stood beside him as his official witness. Cora from the commission administered the oath. Danny swore to protect the Leviathan, to maintain its systems, to honor its purpose, and to serve as a bridge between the ship and all who would use it. When the ceremony ended, something unexpected happened. The Leviathan itself responded. Throughout the ship, systems that had been dormant for millennia activated. Lights that no one had seen in thousands of years began to glow. Chambers that had been locked opened their doors. The ship was showing its approval, marking this moment as significant in its long history. The gathered beings watched in awe as the ancient vessel came more fully to life than it had in recorded history. Danny felt the ship's presence stronger than ever before. It was welcoming him, acknowledging their bond, accepting him not just as a caretaker but as a true partner. Tears ran down his face again, but he was not embarrassed. This was too important for worrying about appearances. He had found his place in the universe. Not a small place or a simple place, but a place that fit him perfectly. Years passed. Danny aged, but the Leviathan did not. He became a permanent fixture of the ship, as much a part of it as the corridors and interfaces. Visiting dignitaries would seek him out for wisdom about the vessel. Young engineers would apply to study under him, hoping to learn some of what he knew. Danny taught what he could, but he always told his students the same thing. The Leviathan would teach them itself if they were willing to listen. His role was just to help them get started. Danny explored new sections of the ship even after decades of searching. The Leviathan was too vast to ever fully know. There were always new mysteries, new chambers, new wonders. He found rooms that seemed to exist outside of time. He found interfaces that connected to places beyond the galaxy.